So Deutsche Bank has just come out with the first forecast of a recession here in the United States, although Jamie Dimon has been saying for a little bit that he expects the same thing. But Deutsche Bank is saying that this is the first from a major bank, a growing concern that the Fed is going to hit the brakes on the economy so hard it will inadvertently end the recovery that just began about a year and a half ago. They're pointing out energy and food commodity prices have spiked since Russia invaded Ukraine. This is echoing through the economy, not just the food crisis that I was talking about in the last half hour, and they're predicting a mild recession. So let's talk about this with our buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. democracyatwork.info, the website, or rdwolff with 2fs.com, and Prof. Wolff on Twitter, PROFWOLFF. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. So first of all, if you want to give us a little bit of a summary of why the Fed tries to deal with inflation by raising interest rates and what the consequences of that are, and how you think this is going to play out here.
Okay, well, the basic economics of this is very old, comes at least out of the 1930s, if not sooner. And the basic idea is if you have an inflation, prices rising, it's because employers figure they can get that money out of us, will pay more for the food, clothing, shelter, and so on. And so one way for the government to try to deal with it, if it's spinning out of control, as it is now, is to make us have less money. And how does the government do that? Raising interest rates. And the idea is if you can't borrow from the government the way you used to because you have to pay higher interest rates, if you're a bank or if you're an institution that deals with the government, if you have to pay the government higher interest rates, you in turn will charge higher interest rates to the individuals and the businesses that come to you. And in short, that will dissuade them. It's a kind of a disincentive to borrow, and that means less will be borrowed, therefore less will be spent, and therefore people thinking about raising prices won't do it or won't do it as much because they're becoming aware that people and businesses just don't have the borrowed money they used to have because interests have been raised. There are a lot of problems with this. It cannot work. It has in the past failed as often as it has succeeded, but that's the standard idea of why the government, and in this case the Federal Reserve, is raising interest rates.
So it seems like a blunt instrument, relatively speaking, and arguably it's just increasing competition. In this case, increasing competition for the scarce resource of money, as opposed to breaking up giant monopolies and increasing competition by having a larger number of small businesses, which arguably could also reduce inflation, correct?
Right, and it could also have, it could be counterproductive. I'll give you an example that's happening right now. As interest rates are going up, so are mortgage rates. In other words, if you want to buy a house or an apartment these days, you're going to have to pay significantly higher interest rates for your mortgage loan than you did 6, 12, or 18 months ago. But here's the irony. Is that slowing down the demand for housing? Not at all. It's having the opposite effect. It's driving the prices up faster. And the explanation is easy. As people are informed by their banker that interest rates are rising because of the federal action, the banker says to the prospective home buyer, you better borrow now, because if you don't, if you wait a few months, you're likely to be facing even higher interest rates. So we get then the peculiarity that the interest rate increase prompts even more spending, driving up prices. In other words, the opposite effect of what raising interest rates were intended to achieve. And that's not a unique thing happening now. That's a constant problem that this whole policy has to face the risk of not working and even making matters worse.
So Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are arguing, among others, that the way to deal with inflation, that some of the inflation we're seeing is just the result of a spike in demand, just like we saw after World War II. where you had food rationing and everything else there for years, and suddenly people could buy things and they rushed into the marketplace. That's happening now post-COVID. But a large part, they're alleging, of this inflation is also caused by the lack of competition, because when Reagan in 1983 told the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice to stop enforcing our nation's antitrust laws, we had this explosion of mergers and acquisitions, the M&A mania, the Michael Milken, the movie Wall Street, greed is good, all this stuff. And that's still with us. And we don't have a single industry in the United States of any consequence any longer that's not dominated by a handful, 2, 3, 4 at the most companies who control well over 80% of the market. So they operate as cartels. So if you could break those companies up, that would create competition that would be the most effective and most long-term effective solution to the problem of inflation. But and Biden has given lip service to that, but the Fed apparently doesn't agree with this, or the Republicans won't go along with it, or the administration is afraid to take on these giant interests. Whatever the reason may be, that's not happening. And so they're trying to use, instead of using a scalpel, they're using basically a 10-pound sledgehammer.
Well, let me comment a little bit on the many points basically that you're raising. When demand increases, as you put it, after World War II, people should not imagine that that necessarily means prices will go up. When demand increases, think of it this way. If there are more people that are about to come into your store, you have two ways of reacting if you're a business owner or operator. You can say, oh boy, I've got all these people coming in, I'm going to raise the price. Absolutely. Free enterprise allows you to do that. But there's a second option, which is, oh boy, I've got a lot of people coming into the store, I'm going to order more merchandise and sell more of it to these people. I don't have to raise my prices. I will make more profit by moving more merchandise. In our system, we allow private enterprises to make that choice, even though they're a tiny minority, and we, the majority, have to live with whichever choice they made, either the inflation, rising prices, or what we would much prefer, more product, because that would actually mean more jobs, and that would be the much better way to go. If Mr. Biden were serious, if the Democratic Party leadership were serious, they would be intervening to make sure that the response of business to more demand wasn't a rising price, which we don't want, but was a rising flow of goods produced and passed through to the customers who have this greater demand. That's the first thing. The second thing is, Tom, let's take a step back. What are we doing in this economic system we're living in? We have just put our people, the vast majority of our fellow Americans, through one of the worst public health disasters in our country's history, through one of the major economic crashes of our capitalist system. That's in 2020 and 2021. Now, in the latter part of 2021 and this first part of 2022, we hit them in the face with an inflation outrunning wages. And now Deutsche Bank, as you rightly foreground, is telling us, oh, wait, we got one more thing to hit you with, a depression or a recession, which is how we're going to deal with the inflation, which is how we dealt with, this is, you're building, and I say this with all humility, you are building a reservoir of anger and bitterness and, frankly, disappointment in our economic system that ought to have the folks at the top little less eager to squeeze more profit and a little bit more worry that they may be destroying the goose that laid the golden egg for them.
Right. So there are a number of tools that could be used. One that I mentioned and I'm enthusiastic about is enforcing our antitrust laws. Another that Bernie is proposing is a windfall profits tax, which, and in order to identify windfall profits, you'd have to identify basically monopolistic behavior. And the withholding of more goods and instead of just raising prices, as you just described. A third would be wage and price controls, which Richard Nixon tried in the 1970s and my recollection is that it didn't work out that well. What's your preference, or is there a fourth option that I'm missing?
Well, my preference would be a mixture of all of them. I mean, we don't have all that much experience. I was paying close attention back in 1971 when Richard Nixon imposed the wage price freeze. And for a good 8 or 9 months, it did the job. It brought down the inflation in this country from the double digits right down to near zero because it was harsh and it was strictly enforced. Now, many, many interests went to work, Republican, Democrat, and so on, to undo that wage price freeze, to open up the exemptions that had been written into it in the first place so that it could be undone. And they were ultimately successful, which I'm not surprised at. But I wouldn't draw from that it couldn't be done if you had a government really committed to do it. And if you coupled some wage and price controls with some effort to make sure that the response to extra demand, if it's really there, is more goods production and jobs and not raising prices, I think you could begin to make some real change. And I would advocate also that a real leader, someone who uses the position of the presidency or the dominant political party, that went out into the countryside and said, hey, the most effective, quick way to prevent prices from going up is for people to say, if we see a price increase, we're going to go elsewhere. We're not going to buy those things. You know, the boycott is a powerful weapon, whatever else you might call it. Jawboning from a leader about this would go a long way to start the ball rolling to make a different economy. But again, let me underscore, even if you reestablish competition, people have to understand that the way capitalism works, the competitors fight each other. One of them wins, and the loser usually goes bankrupt or fades away, and the workers in the losing enterprise then go and get a job in the one that won. In other words, make a long story short, destroys itself and produces the oligopoly, that's the few big ones, or the monopoly. We've seen this over and over again. It's part of capitalism. So we may congratulate ourselves if we reintroduce some competition, but what we're doing is putting back in place the very system, the structure that brought us to the monopoly in the first.
There you go.